All right, good day, class. I congratulate you to moving forward to this module, which is now in we are in module 6, and we'll be discussing later on the performance and authentic assessment. First off, I would like to introduce myself. I am teacher Mel Yarit. Together with me is Miss Nuena and Miss Abshama. But before we dive into the discussion proper, let's have identify the objectives of this discussion. First off, identify the characteristics of performance and authentic assessments. Second, choose the most appropriate performance assessment through making a poster. And last, appreciate the use of performance and authentic assessment by presenting instructional objectives. All right. At this point in time, let's have a Chica minute. What is Chica Minute? It is an activity where you will give at least two examples of helpful assignments and or performance tasks that you've already experienced with, such as the tools that you use during the activities that you presented. And you can input here in our Padlet. Here's the link. And also you can scan in our QR code. Okay, thank you so much for participating to our Padlet or the Chica Minute. And I do believe that um you've already presented the helpful assignments and performance tasks in which it gives actually a smooth sailing of your assignments and performance tasks because of these tools. All right. So why we started this activity in which we're talking about the tools, performances that you've already used, because later on we'll be discussing what are the why we use these tools and why it is important to use. So let's proceed. So before we delve again about this topic, I would like to reiterate or I would like to ask question to you and you can reflect or contemplate about this question. First, why do you need to adapt to what is the current mode of learning? And second, did you find the questions asked in the Padlet relevant to the topics to be presented? Which is the question is the helpful assignments and or performance tasks that you've already experienced or the tools that you've already used. Okay. So I hope that you will contemplate those questions as because as we delve in this topic, you can also reflect about why your answer is like that. Okay. So let's talk about the performance and authentic assessment. Authentic evaluation has garnered attention recently. Not all performance assessments are authentic, in which we're talking about first off authentic assessment. Authentic assessment entails real world skill use. Assessment means assessment tasks themselves are real instances of extended criterion performances rather than proxies or estimators of actual learning goals. It doesn't just talking about the learning about what you have learned to that lesson, but also using these tools as extended criterion or performances in which you can apply what you have already learned about the discussion proper and you can the tools that you will be using later on or the tools that you've already used, it actually gives more emphasis about what you have learned. All right. So performing tasks that are appreciated in your own right is how others define authentic assessment. Again, performing tasks that are appreciated of your own right is how others define authentic assessment because it's actually authentic from the word authentic. It is coming from you or there's a signature about your task or about your um things that you presented. All right. So, for example, the paper and pencil multiple choice assessment are mostly indications of other valued performances. Performances or performance assessments often accompany written tests. Written examinations are better at testing the materials, concepts, and principles that underlie complicated skills than performance evaluation. Written assessments can establish students' knowledge before performance evaluations ask them to construct hypotheses. It actually great uh, great systematic smooth of giving to the students or establishing it towards ourselves. First is the written assessment and later on the performance evaluation or what we call as performance task later on at it actually gives you something that you've already write or you already taken seriously about what you have learned, and then you can also apply it later on to the performance task of what you're doing. So performance assessment vary. They can measure processes and goods. They might not be natural or structured. Most importantly, performance evaluation measures skills that paper and pencil tests cannot. So it it says that you can it's not something that we stop about written examinations, but it actually gives emphasis of what you have learned not just only through written examinations, but as well as to performance tasks or the action or the applications about what they have learned, because it actually weigh the written examination and the performance tasks of the students if we use both of the system or the applicate or the ways to examine the learnings that they've gained. And it also take time to create, administer, and score. Scoring subjectively, like essay tests and causes measurements error. So there's a lot of ways that it actually gives emphasis or it actually have the better adjustment to the students if we also focus on the performance tasks, because there's a lot of errors when we're dealing about written assessments or another ways administers and scores, such as the essay test and then the causes of measurements, which it causes some errors about it. Example for the written examinations as well, there might be indications of error later on, or maybe misconception about what the examination is all about. So I believe that more it's more um, better when we use or when we weigh written examination and as well as the performance test of the students. Okay, so that's the end of the authentic and performance assessment. And now we're down to characteristics of performance assessment. First, there are actually three characteristics of performance assessment. First is the specific behaviors or outcomes of behaviors are to be observed. So, when dealing with the performance assessments, it should have on point to the performance or the behaviors or outcomes that you may observe during, before, and after the performance test. And next, it is possible to judge the appropriateness of students' actions or at least to identify whether one possible response is more appropriate than some alternative response. Next, the process or outcome cannot be directly measured using paper and pencil tests, such as tests involving multiple choice, essay, or another written format. As what I have said earlier, it's actually good when you weigh not just only focusing to the written examinations, it actually add up to the students assessment when we use performance as well, because um as what I have said earlier, it actually add up some knowledge of what they have learned, and they can create um widening their knowledge about what they have learned throughout the discussion. So next one is authentic assessment. A while ago we talked about the performance assessment, and now we're dealing about authentic assessment. So authentic assessment, when it comes to determining how to evaluate the knowledge gained by students in class, the majority of teachers are in agreement that the ideal evaluation would be one that only evaluates the knowledge gained by the students, but also teaches them new skills and improves their understanding of the material covered in the class. The fact that these evaluations are genuine is one of the most important aspects of them. Authentic assessment challenges students to apply what they've learned to a new scenarios and use their judgment to decide what information and abilities are important and how to use them. Authentic assessment or assignments often focus on complex real world situations and their accompanying constraints. They can involve a real world audience of stakeholders or clients as well. According to Grant Wiges, Wiggins, 1998, an assignment is authentic if it is first, um, take note about this one. First is it is realistic. Second, it requires judgment and innovation. Third, ask the students to do the subject. Fourth, replicates or simulates the context in which adults are tested in the workplace or in civic or personal life. Next, assess the student's ability to efficiently and effectively use a repertoire of knowledge and skills to negotiate to a complex task. And last but not the least, allows appropriate opportunities to rehearse, practice, consult resources, and get feedback on refined performances and products. So it boils down that um, authentic assessment, it's not just only dealing about what they have learned all throughout, but it also talk about the learnings and the behavior towards what they have learned, because it's not just all about the being smart, but also being authentic or being the behavior towards your action. Because smart, when you're talking about smart, it's not just only the mind, but also towards your action. So that's end for the of my report, authentic assessment and performance and authentic assessment. And later on, um my group mate will present the other information about our topic, which is performance and authentic assessment. Thank you so much for listening.
Good day everyone, my name is Rosie Pinona and today I will be discussing the categories of performance assessment. Assessment can be divided into numerous categories. In performance assessment, it can be categorized in many ways such as process and products, the simulated and real settings, and lastly the natural versus the structured stimuli. And now let's tackle the process versus the product measures. But first, let us define the process and product. So a process is the procedure that a student uses to complete a task, while the product is a tangible outcome that may be the result of completing a process. So for example, the way in which an individual uses woodworking tools to build a piece of furniture would be the process, while the piece of furniture resulting from working with the tools would be the product. So usually a product is created based on a certain rubrics and criteria. So generally, um, performance assessment is concerned with only the process or only the product, or at least emphasizes one over the other. So for instance, the completed watercolor activity might be assessed, but not the student's technique in producing the painting. So another example, in cooking class or in TLE class, the teacher will ask the student to bake a cake. So um, so the time they took to properly preheating the oven, mixing the eggs and butter is called the process. And once all the steps are being taken, the final product would be the cake. So again, in school, the performance assessment are conducted using either a process or a product-oriented approach. The process-oriented approach evaluates how a skill is being performed, whereas the product-oriented approach evaluates the outcome of the skill performance. Next category is the simulated versus the real setting. So many performance assessment represent simulations because the real situations are too expensive or dangerous to use. So it's either unavailable or impractical for other reasons. So educational simulations is a teaching method that tests participants' knowledge and skills levels by placing them in a scenarios where they must actively solve problems. So the instructor defines the parameters to create a safe environment for hands-on learning experiences. So some simulations are so realistic that they unquestionably represent adequate substitute for the real thing. So, for example, to prepare and examine the new pilots, flight simulations train them so that the students can safely pilot basic aircraft solo without in-flight experiences. So they usually do this before maneuvering the plane. So like murag training sa nila bitaw. So the simulations is usually being taken, for example, sa mga seaman. So I have a friend nga seaman siya ay na study siya kuan. So usually maneuver sila ng mga simulations nga maneuver sila sa barko, something like that. So that is the that is the simulated approach. Well, in authentic assessment place considerable emphasis on realism, or simulated or otherwise. As with any performance assessment, however, realism must go beyond appearances. So having an assessment look real is not sufficient to make an assessment authentic. So the appearances of realism may not even be necessary. So instead, an authentic assessment must incorporate all conditions relevant to the realistic use of the assessed knowledge. So the continuation of this category of performance assessment um, um, would be reported by my groupmate Wilhelm.
Hello everyone, so now let's proceed to the third category of performance assessment, the natural versus structured stimuli. So when a stimulus happens without the observer's involvement, it is considered natural. Like for instance, social skills are often assessed without any guidance from the teacher. However, in other circumstances, a stimulus could be designed to guarantee that the behavior being assessed happens or happen in specific circumstances. So here are a few examples of organized stimuli. So asking a students to prepare and present a speech, conduct a lab experiment, or read aloud. So next is structured stimuli. So it tends to induce maximal performance, but natural stimuli make it easier to observe typical performance. Therefore, it is preferable to use natural stimuli to evaluate a person's personality, work habits, and desire to be adhered to standard like safety regulations. So when you assess a student's ability to write a paper, play an instrument, explain a concept verbally, or execute other tasks, structured stimuli are necessary. So structuring the stimulus also ensures that the performance to be observed will occur. So observation time can be reduced by asking students to do something rather than waiting for it to happen naturally. Structuring also helps determine whether the lack of particular performance results because the student is avoiding a behavior in which he or she is not proficient or because the appropriate condition for eliciting the behavior has yet occurred. So next, let's move on to the advantage of performance assessment. So the first advantage or the most significant advantage of performance assessment is that they allow the evaluation of complex skills which are difficult to assess by written tests. A complex skills draw on a previously learned information, concept, and rules and involves problems that can be solved in a variety of ways. A written test can measure students' understanding or grammar rules. However, a performance assessment must be used to determine whether students can apply these rules when writing. So the learning of complex skills is often the ultimate justification for many subjects taught in school. Without performance assessment, proficiency with these skills generally cannot be evaluated. A second advantage of performance assessment is their effect on instruction and learning. For example, students learn to write in the active voice if writing performance is also going to be assessed. Not only learning the difference between the active voice and passive voice. Similarly, the teacher is more likely to teach how to write in the active voice if the performance assessment is part of the lesson plan. And lastly, the third advantage is that the performance assessment can be used to evaluate the process as well as the product. Whereas written tests, it focuses on the product that results from performing the task. The focus of performance assessment is often the process of students uses to get the product. So example, when observing how the students formulate a hypothesis or techniques they use in a science lab. So observing the process is particularly important in diagnostic evaluation. If a student is having difficulty solving a math problem, an effective way is for the teacher to watch the student work through a problem. So this activity is a performance assessment. And lastly, the last part of this lesson is the limitation of performance assessment. So, one major limitation of performance assessment is the considerable amount of time they require to administer. Although written tests are usually administered simultaneously to an entire class, performance assessment often must be administered to one student or to small group of students. So this limitation makes it difficult to use performance assessment for measuring a substantial number of skills because administering performance assessment in time-intensive, more efficient techniques such as written tests should be used when possible. Next is the second limitation of performance assessment is that the students' responses often cannot be scored later. In particularly when a process rather than a product is being assessed, the observer has to score or record events as they happen. If a tenant behaviors goes unobserved, it goes unmeasured. And the third limitation pertains to scoring. So, like essay tests, the scoring of performance assessment is susceptible to rater error. So, bias, expectation, and inconsistent standards can easily cause teachers to interpret the same observation differently. As with essay tests, this problem can be controlled by developing a carefully scoring plan. And that's it. Thank you for listening and have a good day, everyone.